Hey, it's Ollie. So one of my favorite places in the city lately has been the dinosaur exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History. I've been a few times this year already, and so on my most recent visit I decided to take a bunch of footage and I wanted to give a little bit of a tour. I'm not gonna have time to go over everything because there really is just so much to see, but I am gonna go through some basics about dinosaur classification and museum displays and then walk through some of my favorite specimens in the museum and why I think they're important and cool. I'm gonna leave timestamps in the description if you wanna skip to any particular part of the tour, and also just a quick disclaimer, I'm not a paleontologist, I just love dinosaurs, but I am gonna leave a bunch of resources in the description so you can check out pretty much anything that I'm going to be talking about today. The museum's fossil collection is primarily housed on the 4th floor, so that's where you're going to find the dinosaur exhibit. All of the dinosaur fossils are divided into 2 different halls, the Saurischian and then the Ornithischian halls. So when you're looking at Dinosauria, Ornithischia and Saurischia is going to be that first split in the cladogram, and so all dinosaurs fall into one of these 2 groups. The easiest way to observe the difference between an Ornithischian and a Saurischian dinosaur is going to be in the hip bone. And the hip bone is actually pretty important in the classification of dinosaurs in general, because when you're looking at whether or not something is a dinosaur, the primary trait that they're all going to have in common is the open acetabulum. And that is a small opening in where the upper thigh bone meets the hip. So that's why some things that might look like dinosaurs, or maybe some extinct reptiles that we think of as being dinosaurs aren't, is that they don't have that trait. So what's so significant about the open acetabulum is that it characterizes a change in posture that we see across all dinosaurs. So pre-dinosaur reptiles have a sprawled posture where their legs are going to stick out to the side and their movement looks more like they're crawling than walking. And dinosaurs don't have that. They're going to be a lot more upright, and that's because of the opening in the acetabulum, which you can see pretty clearly in a lot of specimens in the museum. So that's something to look out for as you walk through. Now, when it comes to telling the difference between Ornithischian and Saurischian dinosaurs, it's also going to be in the hip bone, but now we're going to be looking at the pubis bone and the orientation of it. So in Saurischian dinosaurs, the pubis is going to face forward, so that's towards the head of the dinosaur, and then in Ornithischian dinosaurs, it's going to face the rear, so towards the tail of the dinosaur. Something kind of funny about the terminology used here is that Saurischian actually means lizard-hipped dinosaur, while Ornithischian means bird-hipped. We know that birds are dinosaurs, of course, but while they do have that rear-facing pubis bone, they're actually evolved from Saurischian, so lizard-hipped dinosaurs. Then within these 2 main groups, we have subgroups that dinosaurs can be categorized into as well. So in the Saurischian hall, you'll be able to see sauropods, which includes dinosaurs with long necks like Brachiosaurus, Apatosaurus, Diplodocus. You can also see theropods, which is, I guess, the classic, I think what most people imagine when they think of a dinosaur. So it's going to be predators like Allosaurus and Tyrannosaurus Rex. In the Ornithischian hall, you can see ornithopods like Parasaurolophus, ceratopsians, which is the frill-necked dinosaurs, so things like Triceratops, and then also Thyrophora, which is armored dinosaurs like Stegosaurus and Ankylosaurus. There are more groups than that, but those are really all the ones I'm going to be covering in this tour. I also really like that the museum has cladograms on display. I think this gives you a nice way to visualize how these groups evolve from one another and how they're categorized. You can see at the bottom of the cladogram it says Dinosauria and then goes off into the 2 main branches and then the subgroups as well. The museum paints a really nice picture of how these changes happened over time. Dinosaurs were so successful and lived on the earth for such a long time, so it's nice to be able to understand just how different life looked between the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous periods. In regards to the actual specimen on display, the museum has a pretty extensive collection of both trace fossils and body fossils. So trace fossils are going to be anything that gives us evidence of life, and that can be things like nests or footprints. And then body fossils is going to be any preservation of an actual body part, and that's most of what we're going to go over in this tour. I think it's interesting to take note of the variety and coloration between different fossils as well, because it can tell you a little bit about the conditions that the fossil was formed under. So you'll see that some are going to be a little bit more brown or black or white, It's really just going to depend on the sediment that they were buried in. I also want to say that not all of the fossils on display in the museum are going to be the original or real fossils, which is something I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand. It's super common in museums for curators to display a cast instead of the original fossil, and I think that the American Museum of Natural History is actually pretty unique in the fact that it displays a lot of original findings for visitors to see. About 85% of their collection includes original findings, which is really not super common. A lot of the time it just makes more sense for museums to display casts for a few different reasons. For one, it keeps the fossils safer. Original fossils can also be quite heavy, which makes them difficult to mount. And then paleontologists also just need to have these specimens available for study. We're always learning new things about dinosaurs, and it's important to be able to reference previous findings, especially in an instance where maybe there haven't been many discoveries of a particular dinosaur. It's going to be less likely that that kind of specimen would be on display, and it's most likely going to be in storage at the museum. And even when the museum does decide to display an original fossil, a lot of the time you'll still be seeing And even when the museum does display an original fossil, you'll still be seeing at least some replica on display just because of how rare it is for fossils to be found in their entirety. So for example, if a dinosaur is found and it's missing some ribs, an arm, whatever, what's going to happen is that paleontologists will create casts based off of previous findings of the same species and then use those casts to fill in the missing pieces. So you'll often be seeing a partial skeleton and partial cast. Even with findings of new species, if a dinosaur is missing a lot of bone, oftentimes paleontologists will make extrapolations based off of closely related dinosaurs to try to get an understanding of what it may have looked like. So sometimes you may even be seeing casts made from other dinosaurs used to give you the full picture, the final skeleton that's on display for you to look at in the museum. And that's everything that I have for the classification. So with a better understanding of how dinosaur exhibits work, I'm gonna go ahead and get into the actual tour of specimens that I just think are sick at the American Museum of Natural History. So in the Saurischian Hall, which I think is probably the most exciting part of the fossil exhibit, you can see this huge sauropod in the room, which is an Apatosaurus and was actually the first sauropod ever mounted back in the 1890s. So super, super cool, enormous. You can't even really take a picture at it from any place in the room because it's just so big, you can't get the whole thing. Something I think is cool about this specimen also is that for years it actually had the wrong skull mounted. It had a Camarasaurus skull. This was actually one of those things I was talking about before, where there was not a skull found with this Apatosaurus, and so they were making extrapolations and they used a pretty closely related sauropod called Camarasaurus. I'll try to put them side by side, but their skulls are so different. I actually really like Camarasaurus because they have really funny looking heads. So for years there was just that was the understanding of what Apatosaurus looked like. There's actually only one Apatosaurus skull that's ever been discovered. And of course, once it was discovered, they realized that this Camarasaurus skull didn't fit what we thought Apatosaurus looked like at all. So there's been the replacement. Because this is the only Apatosaurus skull that was ever found, it's not on display in the museum. The one on the display in the museum is a cast. In the Saurischian Hall is also a gigantic, genuine fossil of Tyrannosaurus Rex. I think this is probably the most iconic fossil in the museum. It's actually the exact same one that was referenced for the drawing of the Jurassic Park logo. And you'll see it in a lot of advertisement for the museum as well. A lot of museums give their dinosaurs like cool names, like Sue at the Field Museum in Chicago. But this one is just AMNH 5027. She's significant because it's a very impressively complete fossil for a T-Rex, and it was a really early finding as well. When this dinosaur was first mounted, it was actually displayed in an upright position, and it stayed that way for many, many years. This posture shows T-Rex standing at a much greater height, and of course with the tail dragging on the ground. But our understanding of dinosaurs is really always changing, and I think this is a good example of this. In addition to a lot of new things we know about the T-Rex anatomy, like how it would have needed to use its tail to balance, We also have some trace fossils of some tracks of theropods that show that, you know, their tail wasn't dragging on the ground. We would have been able to see the tail mark between the legs, and so we know that it would have walked more lean forward and not in that upright posture that we originally thought. Another cool thing about T-Rex is that originally it was found without hands, and so we had to make kind of some extrapolations about what the hands might have looked like. And because other carnosaurs like Allosaurus have kind of these slightly longer arms with 3 claws, that was what we assumed the T-Rex had as well. So you can see some early illustrations of T-Rex where they have 3 claws instead of just the 2, but of course now we know that they have these really kind of laughably small arms with the 2 claws. The arms probably served like essentially no purpose to an adult T-Rex. They did have quite a bit of strength to them. The claws are pretty sharp, pretty long, and so some people think maybe they could have used these to hold on to prey, to grip them as they're eating, but also pretty likely they might also have just served a purpose in adolescence that they didn't really need in adulthood. So when you look at a younger T-Rex, you can see the arms are like more proportionate to the body, and they just don't really grow, so there's a chance that maybe they used them for some function at a young age and then the arms just didn't develop because they didn't need to. So past the Saurischian hall on the 4th floor, you're going to go into the vertebrate origins. So nothing in here is actually going to be a dinosaur. Not a whole lot to talk about, but there's a few things that I think are interesting here anyway. Overhead, you can see they have some pterosaurs mounted, flying overhead. That's the group that includes some pretty iconic early flyers like pterodactyls and pteranodons, but then also some lesser known monstrosities like Quetzalcoatlus, which I think is really sick. It's probably one of the largest creatures to ever fly, especially in North America. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about them, but I definitely encourage you to look them up. They're also included in the recent prehistoric planet, and they have a scene that includes them fighting with T-Rex that I think is just sick, because they're actually really comparable in size. These birds were enormous. This hall also has the plesiosaur, which is a terrifying marine predator, but also just kind of a funny story in paleontology. Basically, in the 1800s, there were these 2 paleontologists, Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Marsh, who had a pretty intense and kind of silly rivalry with one another. You can see on the plesiosaurus, it kind of has this very exaggerated long neck, which you can see in some other marine dinosaurs too. Plesiosaur isn't even the longest neck that you can see in some of these guys, and I think it's really freaky. But when Edward Drinker Cope kind of discovered this creature and was publishing his paper on it, he actually originally mounted the skull on the wrong side, so thinking that the neck was shorter and then it had this really long tail, which I don't think is a crazy assumption to make, but it was a pretty embarrassing mistake, and his rival kind of never let him live it down. Past vertebrate origins is the orientation hall, which has this absolutely enormous sauropod mount of Titanosaur. This one is a cast completely because it would be way too heavy to mount. Titanosaur is a genus of dinosaur that we're pretty sure is the largest animal to ever walk the earth, and maybe even the largest animal that ever could be. At that size, there's just really a lot of complications that start to come into play. One of the main ones being that it's really difficult to support your own weight. We know for a fact that some of these titanosaurs weighed around 65 tons, and we can estimate that others, based off of partial fossil findings, probably weighed up to 77 tons, which is just absurd. It's kind of difficult to even understand how these things supported themselves. Not just Titanosaur, but also Apatosaurus and any other sauropod really. We know for a fact that they had some pretty well cushioned pads on the heels of their feet, because if they didn't have these pads, the weight of their body would have crushed the bones on their toes. Another pretty big complication with the enormous sauropods in general is the question of how they were able to pump blood all the way through that long neck and up to their brain, which is pretty important. It just takes a really impressive level of blood pressure to get blood up that high. And so there are people who think that maybe sauropods didn't actually lift their heads up in the upright posture that we associate and actually held them more level or even below heart level to help with circulation. For me, this doesn't make a lot of sense. It is something that's still very much up for discussion, up for debate. There's just a lot of evolutionary disadvantages that come along with a long neck if you're not using it to keep upright. Keeping your neck at ground level is going to make you pretty vulnerable to predators because that's just such a large body part that is, you know, at their reach. Holding your head down at that level too, they also don't have very good visibility around them. With their bodies being so large, you'd think they want to have their head up high so they're able to have a better understanding of what's going on around them. And then of course the most obvious one is just that these things needed to eat a lot, and so it's kind of assumed the reason that they evolved these really long necks is to be able to reach the vegetation so that they have access to food that other animals don't. And if you take that away from them, then there's not really a lot of reason for them to have this long neck in the first place. They could have, you know, only lifted their necks to eat and then walked with their necks lower most of the time. But there also are some other ways to explain how they would have been able to circulate blood even if they did walk with upright necks most of the time. It's possible that they just had a really, really large heart, or maybe even multiple hearts that could have been placed kind of up higher in their neck. Also kind of in between the exhibits, they have the nest of the Oviraptor, which is one of my favorite stories in paleontology. Basically, the Oviraptor means egg thief, and they named it this because the skeleton was found kind of clutching around a nest of eggs, and they concluded, this was an animal that fed on eggs, fed on young, and you know, this finding is evidence of that. But later, you know, we discovered that the Oviraptor was actually with its own nest and was protecting its own eggs. And so this was actually some really early evidence of like paternal, maternal instincts in dinosaurs, and you know, that's a big argument in favor of social behaviors in dinosaurs. But she's still called Oviraptor, still called egg thief, which is kind of messed up. So going through the orientation hall after that, they have some mammalian exhibits, but I didn't stop through there yesterday. And then you get to the Ornithischian hall. One of my favorite fossils in the museum is in this part, and it's going to be the Edmontosaurus, which is a hadrosaur, or one of the duck-billed dinosaurs. I think that this is a cool display because it really is a good way to understand facultative bipedalism. We use the term biped to refer to dinosaurs that walk upright, and then we use quadruped to refer to dinosaurs that walk on four legs. And then we just precede it with facultative or obligate to either say that they are only able to walk this way or they are able to do both. So facultative is both. Maybe that means they usually walk on four legs, but they go on two legs to run. There's usually still some sort of preference between the two. But I think it's a really cool kind of transitional evolutionary feature in dinosaurs. The display of Edmontosaurus does show both an upright position and them walking on four legs, which I just think is neat. One of my favorite dinosaurs ever is actually also a hadrosaur, and that's Parasaurolophus, though the museum does not have an entire fossil of this species. They only have the skull available, but you can still see the coolest part of the dinosaur because it is the skull. They have these hollow crests. It's a hollow crested hadrosaur, and for a long time we weren't really sure what they used these crests for, but now we're almost completely certain that they use them to make sounds, to communicate. And we've even been able to kind of recreate these skulls with 3D modeling, and now we know pretty much exactly the sound that it would have produced, and I just think it is so like hypnotic, so beautiful. I'm gonna play a second of it, and I'm also gonna link it down in the description if you want to hear it, because I just really love these little musical guys. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is actually another hadrosaur in this exhibit, and that is a mummy fossil. Mummy fossils are pretty rare to find, and it's super exciting when we do because they're really helpful in giving us an understanding of what dinosaurs actually looked like. So this one has some really clear skin imprints where you can see the texture, the scales, and it's just so cool to be able to see in person. We learn a lot through mummy fossilization and then also amber fossilization, which is even more rare. We actually got evidence of feathers on theropods from amber fossilization. So it's just super cool and super exciting when we find these things. I don't really want to get too much into the topic of feathers on dinosaurs because that's a whole other thing, but there are some small theropods on display in the museum as well that show you some feathers on smaller theropods. But there's just so much always to learn and so much always changing. I really didn't even talk about everything that I wanted to. I was trying to keep it as condensed as possible, but I just couldn't narrow it down anymore. I know this video is already pretty long. These are just some of my favorite fossils at the museum and a little bit about why I think they're cool and important, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about these guys. I am leaving a bunch of resources down in the description if you want to learn more about anything that I talked about today or about the American Museum of Natural History. I might make more videos about more specified topics or even more videos about museums in the city, depending on if you guys like this and if I decided I had fun making it. But anyway, thanks for spending your time listening to me info dump about dinosaurs, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.